The frost cracked like old bones under her boots. That sound, sharp, final, was the first thing she heard each morning now, before the scrape of the bucket on the frozen ground, before the rasp of her own breath hanging white and heavy in the air, before the hollow silence of the stable smelling of hay and cold stone and something else, absence. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is the horse they left behind? Winter had settled deep into the mountain valley, a suffocating blanket of white and gray. The wind found every crack in the ancient stable walls, whispering through gaps worn smooth by generations of animals and grief. Elara moved through the gloom, a shadow wrapped in layers of wool, her movements precise, automatic. Feed the mare, break the ice on the water trough, muck out the stall, tasks carved into her days, anchors against the tide of emptiness that threatened to pull her under. She didn't look at the mare directly, not at first. Not the way he used to, with that easy grin, a whispered joke only the horse seemed to understand. Elara kept her gaze lowered, fixed on the worn leather of the feed bucket, the chipped stone of the trough. Looking felt like touching a wound. The mare stood in the far corner of her stall, a silhouette against the weak light filtering through a high, dust-coated window. Her name was Aster, a relic from another life, spoken less and less now. She was a mountain horse, sturdy and thick-coated, built for the brutal winters and treacherous paths. But she wasn't just sturdy. There was a stillness about her, a watchfulness that went beyond ordinary animal wariness. She didn't fidget, didn't pace. She simply was. A silent monument in the gloom. Elara felt that presence like a physical pressure. Aster's gaze followed her, heavy and unblinking. It wasn't. Hostile, not exactly. More like waiting, an unfinished sentence hanging in the frigid air between them. Elara's throat tightened. She focused on scooping grain, the kernels rattling too loudly in the quiet. She remembered the sound of his voice filling this space, the warmth of his. Hand on Aster's neck, the way the horse would turn her massive head, ears pricked forward, utterly focused. Now, the silence swallowed everything. She moved to the stall door, sliding the bolt back with a metallic scrape that echoed. Aster didn't flinch. Her ears, dark points against her dun coat, swiveled minutely, tracking Elara's every shift. Elara pushed the door open just wide enough, stepping back quickly, giving the mare space. Always space. It felt safer. "All right," Elara murmured, the word barely more than a breath clouding the air. Not a command, not an invitation, just an acknowledgement of the necessary task. "Water!" She lifted the heavy bucket. Aster didn't move. Her dark, liquid eyes held Elara's for a fleeting second, a flicker of contact that felt like a jolt. Then they dropped, fixed on the bucket. Elara carefully poured the water into the trough, the splash unnaturally loud. The ice she'd broken earlier bobbed on the surface. She stepped back again, wiping her numb hands on her trousers. Aster shifted her weight. One hoof lifted, set down deliberately on the packed earth floor, not approaching, just considering. Her breath plumed steadily in the cold, a rhythmic counterpoint to Elara's own shallow gasps. The wind moaned outside, rattling the loose pane in the window. Inside, the only sounds were the horse's soft breathing and the frantic beating of Elara's own heart, trapped behind ribs that felt too tight. Days bled into weeks, a monochrome tapestry of cold and routine. Elara spoke little, even to herself. Words felt like stones in her mouth. Aster remained a silent observer. Yet, patterns emerged in the quiet. Elara noticed how the mare's ears would prick forward almost imperceptibly when she entered the stable, a subtle alertness replacing the deep stillness. She noticed how Aster would sometimes turn her head just so, angling it towards the corner where his old saddle still hung, draped in a dusty canvas cover. A saddle Elara couldn't bring. herself to touch. One afternoon, the cold was particularly vicious, biting through layers. Ilara's fingers, clumsy in thick mittens, fumbled with the stiff latch on the feed bin. A small, frustrated sound escaped her, a huff of breath, sharp and unexpected in the silence. The bin lid slipped from her grip, clattering onto the high, stone floor with a jarring bang. Ilara froze, bracing for the mare's startled reaction, the thud of hooves against wood. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt the air shift behind her. Slowly, cautiously, she turned. Aster stood at the open stall door. Not pushing through, not demanding. Just there. Her head was lowered slightly, her neck curved. Her eyes, deep pools of brown, were fixed on Ilara, not the fallen lid. There was no fear in them, only a profound, unsettling stillness, and something else, a quiet intensity, a question. Ilara's breath caught, the frantic thudding of her heart against her ribs was the only sound she could hear now, drowning out the wind. She took an involuntary step back. Aster didn't advance. She simply watched. Her nostrils flared once, drawing in Ilara's scent mingled with the sharp tang of cold metal and spilled grain. A cloud of warm breath bloomed between them, a fragile bridge in the frigid air, time stretched. Ilara stood motionless, trapped in that unwavering gaze. The grief, usually a heavy, familiar ache in her chest, sharpened suddenly into a raw point. It was the quietness of the horse, the lack of reaction to the noise, the sheer focused attention directed solely at her. It felt like being seen for the first time since he'd gone, and the weight of it was terrifying. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Aster stretched her neck forward. Not quickly, not forcefully, just an inch, then another. Her muzzle, soft and dark, reached towards Ilara, stopping. A hand's breadth from her wool-clad arm. The horse's breath warmed the fabric. Her nostrils flared again, a soft, snuffling sound. She wasn't sniffing for food. She was investigating. The woman, the tension, the silent storm raging inside. Ilara didn't move. Couldn't. She felt pinned by that gentle, persistent curiosity. Her own breath hitched, a tiny, broken sound. She watched the velvety muzzle hover near her sleeve, felt the faint puff of warm air against her skin. The distance between them, carefully maintained for months, collapsed in that quiet moment. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was a tentative probe, a wary acknowledgement across a chasm of shared loss. Aster's head dipped lower. Not to nudge, not to push, just resting. Her broad forehead came to rest lightly against the worn wooden top rail of the stall door. Her eyes, half-lidded now, remained fixed on Ilara. A sigh, deep and resonant, shuddered through the mare's powerful frame, ruffling the thick winter coat on her neck. It wasn't a sound of weariness. It felt like an offering. A silent, steadfast presence in the face of the cold and the echoing silence. Ilara stared at the horse's head, resting against the wood, the dark forelock falling over one eye. The raw point of grief inside her didn't vanish, but something shifted, a tiny, almost imperceptible loosening of the vise around her chest. The mare wasn't demanding anything. She wasn't filling the silence he'd left. She was just there, solid, enduring, watching. Ilara took a slow, shaky breath. The air still tasted like ice and hay and absence, but now, under the sharpness, there was the warm, animal scent of the horse, the soft rhythm of her breathing. Ilara lifted her hand, hesitating for a long moment just inches from the mare's neck. The thick winter coat looked coarse, inviting. Her fingers trembled. Could she? Should she? She didn't touch. Not yet. The moment felt too fragile, the bridge too new. Instead, she let her hand hover, mirroring the mare's earlier gesture. Acknowledgement. Aster's ear flicked towards the movement, but her head stayed resting on the rail, her breathing steady. The wind howled again, a lonely sound outside the stable walls. Inside, a different kind of quiet had settled, heavy, charged, but no longer quite so desolate. Alara finished her tasks in silence, moving with a strange new awareness of the creature sharing the space. She refilled the water, scooped the grain, her movements less automatic now, more conscious. Aster watched her, head still resting on the rail. When Alara finally turned to leave, closing the stable door carefully behind her, the familiar crunch of frost under her boots sounded different. Sharper, maybe, more real. She walked a few paces towards the small, snow-buried cottage, the cold biting at her cheeks. Then she stopped. A prickle ran down her spine, a sense of being watched not from the house, but from behind. Slowly, she turned back. The stable door was shut, but pressed against the small, grimy window set high in the wood, filling the pane. Completely was Aster's face. One large, dark eye stared out at her, unblinking through the glass, watching her go. The mare didn't whinny, didn't stamp. She just stood there, her breath fogging the cold pain from the inside, her gaze fixed on Alara's retreating figure. Alara stood rooted in the snow, the wind tugging at her coat. The cottage chimney puffed smoke into the gray sky, a promise of warmth she suddenly didn't want. The raw, hollow ache was still there, a familiar companion. But now, layered beneath it, was a bewildering pull, a silent question hanging in the frozen air between the stable and the path home. She didn't understand this horse, didn't understand the depth of that silent watching, the weight of that simple resting of a head. Aster was a legacy, a burden, a living reminder of everything she'd lost. And yet, Alara took one step back towards the stable, then another. Her boots broke the pristine snow, leaving dark marks on the white. The eye in the window tracked her. The mare didn't move from the glass. She didn't know why. But when she reached the stable door again, her hand was already lifting to slide the bolt. The winter deepened, a vice tightening around the valley. Snow piled high against the stone walls of the cottage, muffling the world into a suffocating silence. Inside the stable, the air hung heavy with the scent of horse and hay, and the sharp, metallic tang of deep cold. Alara moved through her chores with a new, quiet awareness. Aster was no longer just a shadow in the corner, a relic of loss. That moment at the stall door, the warm breath on her sleeve, the heavy head resting against the wood, it had shifted something fundamental. An unspoken truce, perhaps. A fragile bridge built over the chasm. She still didn't speak much. Words felt clumsy, unnecessary in the face of Aster's profound silence. But she saw the mare now. Really saw her. Saw the way her ears, constantly mobile, swiveled like radar dishes, catching sounds Alara couldn't perceive. The groan of ice-laden branches far up the slope, the whisper of snow shifting under, its own weight, the distant crack of a frozen stream. Saw the subtle tension that sometimes rippled through Aster's powerful frame, a coiled spring beneath the thick winter coat, her dark eyes fixed not on Alara, but on the mountain looming. Behind the stable wall, it started subtly. Alara would be mending a bridle, the rhythmic snick-snick of the needle the only sound, when Aster would suddenly lift her head, nostrils flaring wide, ears pricked rigidly forward, not towards the door but upwards, towards the unseen peak. A low rumble, felt more than heard, would vibrate through the stable floor. The mountain settling, the old-timers called it. But Aster's reaction was immediate, intense. A tremor running down her flank, a soft, anxious blowing through her nostrils. She'd shift her weight, restless, her gaze locked on the stone wall as if she could see through it to the slopes beyond. 1. Afternoon, clearing snow from the stable roof, Elara slipped. Her boots skidded on ice, sending a small cascade of snow and loose slates clattering down. The noise was sharp, sudden. Below, Aster didn't startle sideways as a normal horse might. She froze, utterly still. Then a sound ripped from her throat. Elara had never heard before. Not a whinny, not a scream, but a deep, guttural groan of pure, primal terror. Her eyes rolled white, showing the panic, her entire body trembling violently. It wasn't the noise of her fall. It was the avalanche of snow and debris mimicking something far more terrible. Elara scrambled down, heart hammering. Aster? Easy, easy, girl. It's nothing, just me. She approached slowly, hands held low, voice deliberately soft. The mare's flanks heaved, sweat darkening her coat despite the cold. Her gaze darted past Elara, fixed on the mountain, wall with terrifying focus. It wasn't fear of the human. It was fear for the human. Fear of the mountain. A fear etched deep, bone deep. Elara remembered the shepherd, Aster's first master, taken by an early spring slide 3 years back. Found days later, half buried. Aster had been found nearby, trembling, unharmed but wild-eyed. Had she seen it, felt it, carried the terror of that moment ever since, a ghost haunting her steady gaze? The realization was a physical blow. Elara sank onto an upturned bucket near Aster's stall, the cold wood seeping through her trousers. She'd thought her grief was private, a solitary burden. But Aster carried her own ghost. The ghost of the man who'd whispered to her, trusted her, whose life had ended in the roar of snow. And she carried the echo of that terror, a silent alarm bell tuned to the mountain's shifting moods. Elara hadn't just inherited a horse. She'd inherited its silent, vigilant trauma. The weight of it, the shared, unspoken dread, pressed down on her chest, stealing her breath. She looked up at Aster. The mare had calmed slightly, but her eyes were still wide, fixed on the wall, her ears flicking erratically, catching sounds only she could decipher. The careful distance Elara had maintained felt like a lie. They weren't separate islands of grief. They were bound by the same devastating current. A sob rose, sharp and unexpected, tearing from her throat. Then another. The dam holding back. Months of solitary sorrow, of anger at the unfairness, of the sheer, aching loneliness of being left behind, shattered. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking, the tears hot and fierce against her icy skin. She cried for the shepherd whose laughter used to fill the stable. She cried for the hollow ache in her own life. She cried for this magnificent, broken creature trembling beside her, carrying a terror she couldn't voice. She didn't hear Aster move. One moment she was lost in the storm of her own weeping, the next she felt warmth. A solid, immense presence beside her. Aster had stepped silently to the stall door. Not nudging, not demanding attention, simply standing close. Elara felt the heat radiating from the mare's massive body, a living furnace against the biting cold. She felt the slow, deliberate rhythm of Aster's breathing, deep and steady, a counterpoint to her own ragged gasps. The horse lowered her head, not to investigate, not to seek comfort for herself. She rested her broad, velvety muzzle gently against the crown of Elara's bent head. A weight, an anchor. A silent, profound pressure that said, I am here. I stand with you. Breathe. Elara leaned into that warmth, into that solid, silent strength. She didn't reach up to touch. She simply let herself be held by Aster's presence, by the slow rhythm of her breath, by the undeniable reality of shared suffering and silent solidarity. The tears didn't stop immediately, but the frantic edge of panic, the feeling of drowning alone, subsided. She cried until she was empty, until the sobs became shuddering breaths, her forehead pressed against the cool wood of the stall door, Aster's muzzle a steady weight on her hair. The mare didn't move, didn't pull away. She stood sentinel, breathing slow, radiating warmth, weathering the human storm with a patience as deep as the mountain itself. Time blurred. The stable, the cold, the silent threat outside. It all receded. There was only this, the shared breath, the offered warmth, the unspoken understanding that grief, however deep, didn't have to be borne alone. Weeks passed. The days grew infinitesimally longer, though the cold held its grip. The brittle tension that had defined the early winter softened. Alara found herself talking more. Not grand pronouncements, but quiet observations spoken into the stable stillness as she worked. Winds picking up from the east asked her, or icicles like daggers today. The mare would often respond with a soft snuffle, a flick of an ear, her dark eyes following Alara with a calm attentiveness that felt less like watching and more like listening. Aster seemed calmer, too. The rigid vigilance remained, especially when the mountain groaned but the edge of panic had smoothed. She no longer stood in the far corner. Often, she'd be near the stall door when Alara entered, her head lowered slightly in a gesture that felt like quiet expectation. One crisp morning, sunlight, weak but genuine, streamed through the high stable window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. Alara was oiling leather, an old halter that had belonged to the shepherd. Her fingers worked the supple hide, the familiar scent of saddle soap mixing with hay and horse. Aster stood nearby, head over the stall door, watching. Her gaze drifted past Alara, settling on the canvas-covered saddle hanging in the corner. The saddle Alara couldn't bring herself to touch. The silence felt different today. Lighter, expectant. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, Alara walked to the corner. She hesitated only a moment before pulling the dusty canvas cover away. The worn leather saddle emerged, smelling of oil and old journeys. Aster let out a soft breath, a sigh that seemed to hold years. Her muzzle stretched towards it, not touching, just remembering. Alara traced a finger over the smooth leather seat, worn thin by countless hours in the saddle. Then, her fingers brushed against something stiff tucked deep into the gullet beneath the pommel. A piece of paper folded small and tight, protected from the elements. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out. Unfolding the brittle paper, she recognized the shepherd's messy scrawl immediately. Not a letter to her. A note to himself, perhaps. A reminder. It was dated just days before the avalanche. Remember, Aster knows the mountain like her own breath. Trust her ears. Trust her feet. If she balks, if she looks up and won't move, listen. Snow lies. She doesn't. Alara stared at the words, the simple, urgent truth in them. Aster wasn't just afraid. She was knowledgeable. Her vigilance wasn't just trauma. It was hard-won. Instinct. A profound attunement to the mountain's treacherous whispers. The shepherd hadn't just loved this horse. He had trusted her with his life. And in the end, she'd tried to warn him. The final gift wasn't just the horse, or the saddle. It was this, the understanding that Aster held wisdom Alara hadn't known to see. A wisdom born of survival, of deep connection, of a language spoken in shifted snow and trembling ground. She looked from the note to Aster. The mare's dark eyes met hers, clear and steady. There was no reproach, only a quiet, ancient knowing. Alara reached out, not towards the saddle this time, but towards the horse. Her hand, no longer trembling, rested gently on Aster's neck, just below the thick mane. The coarse winter hair was warm beneath her palm. Aster didn't flinch. She lowered, her head slightly, leaning into the touch with a soft, contented snort, her breath warm against Alara's sleeve. The sunbeams stretched across the stable floor, catching the dust motes, warming the worn leather of the saddle, illuminating the simple, profound truth hanging in the air between woman and horse. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with understanding, with trust slowly earned, with the quiet echo of a love that hadn't died, but had been passed on, carried on 4 steady legs, and a heart that remembered the mountain's every sigh. Ilara stood there, hand resting on the warm, solid reality of Aster, the note held loosely in her other hand. The deep freeze of grief hadn't vanished, but it had thawed at the edges, revealing something else beneath, a fragile, resilient hope. The shepherd was gone, but his wisdom lived on. His trust lived on. In this creature who had carried his weight, shared his journeys, and now, against all odds, was teaching his broken-hearted partner how to listen to the world again, how to trust the ground beneath her feet, how to breathe through the cold. The mountain loomed outside, vast and ancient and indifferent. But inside the stable, warmed by the weak sun and the shared presence, Ilara felt a quiet strength seeping back into her bones. It wasn't her own strength, not yet. It was borrowed, given, carried. Sometimes the ones who carry you are the ones no one else saw coming. If this story of silent courage and unbreakable bonds found a place in your heart, do something for me. Smash that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me how Aster made you feel. Ring the bell so you never miss the next story that might just mend a piece of your world, because here, we believe in the quiet heroes, and we believe in the power of sharing their light. See you tomorrow.